Good morning and welcome to today's EuroSTAR webinar on Agile testing presented by Fran of Insight Test Services. During today's webinar, the question manager will be available to allow attendees to ask questions. Following the 30-minute presentation, Fran will answer as many questions as we have time for. Please note the question manager will only allow each attendee to ask one question at a time. Questions can be asked by clicking the Q&A drop-down on the top, and a question and answer box will appear. I'll just now hand you over to Fran. Good morning, Fran.
Hello, and welcome to everyone. This is my first webinar, so it's kind of unusual not to see your audience and get immediate feedback. Like when people fall asleep on the front row, I usually change my style, but I'll give it my best shot, and hopefully you'll drive some value out of the next 30, 40 minutes or so. My own background and interest is in process improvement and good practice. And we take a very pragmatic approach to this because process is what people do. So we focus on practices that help solve problems. We focus on practices that help achieve performance-related improvement goals. So increasingly we're helping organizations who are transitioning to Agile and who want to improve their current implementation of Agile practices. So this talk is based in part on those experiences. It's also based in part on a EuroSTAR workshop that I ran in December in Stockholm, EuroSTAR 2007 on Agile testing. There was a lot of experiences shared there. There was, I think, about probably 200 people in the workshop who were sharing their own experiences of Agile testing. And for example, some of the things they shared were some organizations had roughly the same time to market with Agile approaches, but what they found was that they were then delivering the right system, though, in those situations. Other organizations talked about how they'd been successful at implementing Agile at multi-site through the use of high-quality video conferencing, having teams that kind of go face-to-face first, have joint meetings face-to-face, and then have regular kind of 6 monthly meetups and culture days. And they found that they've been able to implement and get that team spirit going, which is required in Agile. Also, one organization described how their developers weren't automating their unit testing. At the other end of the scale, there was an organization who described how their automated tests, their verification code, was 5 times the size of the target code. So there's a big spectrum out there in terms of experiences, and part of what this kind of talk is to share some of those experiences. And also the positive experiences. Sometimes you hear a lot, and we are going to talk a lot about some of the issues and challenges, but there's a lot of positive experiences out there for testers as well. For example, being involved very early. Some organizations talked about how their testers are delirious that they're using Agile approaches now, as opposed to seeing it as an unwelcome change and de-emphasizing the role of QA. They're embracing it in a much more positive kind of way. So the objective of the webinar is to give you a brief overview. I'm going to go through the preamble pretty quickly. We've only got 30 minutes. And I'm going to focus down on a few kind of key areas within Agile, test-driven development, the role of the tester in particular, and then if we have time, talk a little bit about exploratory. And then mixed in with that, talk a little bit more about some of the challenges and issues that we've observed and that were shared during that workshop at EuroSTAR. So the preamble then, just the Agile view of traditional development, with a waterfall type of approach, would involve, very sequential development, all the requirements defined up front and so on. Analysis, design, code, unit tests, move on to system tests, and then get into UAT and release. But a lot of rework would take place towards the end of the life cycle, expensive rework when bugs are found. You're delivering the whole system in one go, and you get a lot of problems towards the end. Also, the quality pressure, things get delayed, testing gets squeezed, and you release with lower quality. And as well, you may be releasing a system that the user doesn't want because there hasn't been sufficient definition of good quality requirements and validation of those requirements. Or indeed, the business may have changed what they need in the 12 months it's taking you to deliver this system. So that's the kind of one perspective on let's say, traditional development. A slightly better view of the traditional development is the V model rather than waterfall model because it emphasizes the different levels of testing and their objectives, and the fact that these different levels of testing are focusing on checking and verifying against different drivers. For example, system test focuses on the system requirements. typically documented in something like a functional specification, which includes both functional and non-functional requirements. So therefore, system tests would also look at functionality, but also look at some of the non-functional areas like performance and usability and so on. And indeed, non-functional areas could be handled in some of these other levels too, for example, at the unit and integration level. This is just an example. There could be 2 levels, there could be 8 levels. It depends on the context, depends on the situation. And for example, you could be doing system integration tests. That could be an important area to focus on and be defined at its own level. As well as doing dynamic testing, of course, then you can talk about static testing, like reviews and the use of static analysis tools. And again, static analysis tools have a role to play in an agile environment as well. Emphasizing early test design is, in a sense, an element of what you find in test-driven development in terms of being able to define your test cases up front, which clarify the requirements and so on. In terms of each test case is a model of the behavior that you're looking for, and therefore it elaborates and effectively takes on a specification role, which is one of the elements of test-driven development that we're going to talk about. So I'm sure you've all seen the Agile Manifesto, focusing on these areas of individuals and interactions, working software, the importance of customer and collaboration, or whoever can represent the customer successfully in your organization, responding to change and so on. An important point to make here, though, is that there is a statement at the end which says that there is value in the items on the right, although the items on the left are valued more. Some people make the mistake of assuming that this statement says there is no value at all in the items on the right. And a lot of it is about what's appropriate in different contexts. In terms of the Agile methodologies, there's a number of them out there. XP, being one of the most commonly quoted ones. Quite a disciplined, engineering, rigorous type of approach to development, very developer-centric, as is Crystal, but Crystal is more of a lightweight approach. Scrum focuses more on the management aspects, the work management aspects, so it provides a kind of a lightweight framework for that. DSDM is a rapid application development-based approach that's often included into the Agile suite of methods, and so on. We get Lean, which comes from manufacturing, and so on. What we observe in practice is that organizations sometimes only partially implement some of these methods, and that can cause issues, particularly from the point of view of testing, in terms of what's an appropriate testing strategy to take when you're doing XP, for example, without pair programming. That introduces a risk, for example, which maybe needs to be compensated for in terms of your overall testing strategy. We've also come across many organizations who maybe have swung towards Agile, but then have had problems and have brought back some of the practices that they used previously and combined them to create hybrid approaches that best solve the kind of problems that they're facing. In terms of Agile development, you're obviously going to be delivering with iterations. And you're going to be trading off the features versus time, rather than, say, with a more traditional development where you may be squeezing your testing at the end and therefore trading off quality versus time. The idea is to deliver something of value to the customer at earlier stages. And again, you can read this for yourself in terms of the message that's been got across here in terms of documented process, and maybe taking that to an extreme. Similarly, you can look at Agile and you can say, well, maybe there are extreme implementations of that also don't make sense, So plan-driven and Agile are just solution strategies, and you first need to identify what the problem is that you're trying to solve. In a sense, you could argue there are no best practices, only good practices in context. And increasingly, organizations are selecting maybe from both approaches, plan-driven and Agile, to solve their problems. The focus of Agile testing includes these kind of areas here. This isn't exhaustive, but it's some of the areas. There's a strong customer focus. Therefore, you focus on high-value features first. You can be multiple builds, delivering value, test-driven development, or behavior-driven development, a slight modification on that, or change to the perspective on that. I can talk about later. And linked in with that, of course, automated unit testing and acceptance testing are obviously part of that too. Exploratory testing is a key focus with Agile as well, as is continuous build and integration. Some of the challenges that we've observed with Agile are, first of all, the change when you move from a sequential kind of life cycle to a more iterative, incremental development approach. That obviously creates challenges to traditional testing approach. You can't define your plan in one go up front. You can't define all your test cases at the start. You've got to be much more adaptive in terms of your strategy. But you're getting constant feedback from the iterations, which is a very positive situation to be in compared to not getting that feedback until late in the life cycle. Also, there are hybrid approaches in terms of, as I talked earlier, in terms of mixing and matching Agile with non-Agile, and also implementing aspects of Agile but needed to compensate for the aspects that you're not actually implementing. The key challenge that we're going to talk in a bit more depth later on is the role of the tester in terms of integration into the development team. There's a change here. Typically, you've got independent testers having to change and actually become part of the development team and work in a much more collaborative way, and that can sometimes create challenges for testers as well. From the point of view of testing strategy, to broaden out the next point here around the levels and phases of testing, what does acceptance testing mean? It's a phrase that's used, for example, in XP, you have unit testing and acceptance testing. You're kind of predefining your testing strategy to have two test levels, but is that appropriate? Is the question. And what exactly is acceptance testing? What happens to system testing? Are we dropping that? Is it part of acceptance testing now? So sometimes there's confusion and challenges around the testing strategy to use in different situations, particularly when people are using hybrid approaches. You need to consider what's appropriate in different contexts based on risk, for example. Another challenge would be the effectiveness of automated tests. Again, a bad test that's automated is still a bad test. So just because you're automating testing doesn't necessarily mean you're doing good testing, which is something that we've observed as well. I'll talk a little bit more about. In terms of additional challenges, there we go. As I mentioned, system testing, like, is it part of acceptance testing? Do we need to do elements of system testing or not in different situations? You've got challenges around project and test management. You may have to be dealing with a variable scope. You're dealing sometimes in situations where you need to have a fixed price, or you've got formal tendering situations. And in a situation where you're trading off your scope against time, that can sometimes create challenges. Similarly around estimation and so on. So as I say, some organizations are wrapping some of the traditional kind of project management practices around Agile, finding that sometimes if they just implement XP without adapting their management approach, they have difficulties. So there are challenges around that too. Lack of documentation obviously is something that the testers are used to dealing with, or documented requirements and functional specs and then using them to drive test cases. You don't have that luxury, that level of detail, so therefore, how do you go about deriving good test cases and moving to a more communicative style? Scale is another issue, of course, in terms of whether Agile scales up to kind of larger projects. Multi-site teams, as I mentioned, creates challenges because tightly knit teams, strong focus on daily communication, regular communication can sometimes be difficult when you've got distributed development and offshoring and so on. So as I mentioned, some organizations have a lot of difficulty. That organizations talk about how they use video conferencing and so on to help those situations. Okay. Some of the additional issues that we've seen in Agile testing have been to substitute unit tests for acceptance tests. No matter how comprehensive your unit tests are, end-to-end acceptance tests, give us information that unit tests can't. They give us perspective on the end user experience as opposed to the internals conforming to explicit expectations. So there's a completely different objective going on there in terms of the two levels of testing. And trying to substitute one for the other kind of creates problems. Similarly, it may be difficult to automate the higher level tests. There's more pain. But as people sometimes say, if it's painful, you need to do more of it. There's an element of that at the acceptance level too. Not automating the acceptance level tests obviously creates issues around regression and so on, because people tend not to do as much manual. We have, of course, come across organizations that have done manual acceptance level type testing and have just basically invested in the manual regression testing. However, there have often been situations where they've been able to let offshore facilities to do that. And in many organizations, it's a requirement really to be doing automation at the acceptance level as well. Similarly, thinking that just by having some automated unit tests and acceptance level that's sufficient is sometimes a pitfall that people fall into. And increasingly, exploratory testing is a valuable part of the strategy to supplement your automated unit and acceptance level tests, as we're going to talk about. Forgetting about non-functional tests is another key area. A lot of the user stories, for example, rarely articulate the non-functional characteristics, quality characteristics like performance and so on. And as a result, they tend to get omitted, or they tend to get only focused on very late after multiple iterations have taken place. And sometimes the issues around areas like performance can be very problematic in terms of reworking, therefore. And based on a method that is trying to reduce waste, that's a key factor, a key issue we've seen quite a lot in organizations that are using Agile is this omission of the non-functional area. Focusing for a second then for a minute then on the role of the tester. There's a couple of quotes there from Ken Kainer and Brett Petticord. The nature of the tester's role does change, Basically, they're no longer the last bastions of quality at the end of the project. They're no longer the independent perspective. They're part of a team that's collaborating with a group to achieve higher quality. And that can sometimes create difficulties for testers to make that kind of cultural shift in terms of their role and their perspective. But in many organizations, the experience is a very positive, not necessarily as a negative thing. And then as well, dedicated testers bring two key benefits, of course. They focus on the black box view. They focus on what's required by the business rather than the technical implementation, which is obviously what a programmer more. They focus on uncovering flaws over confirming completeness. And one of the things we've seen has been many of the automated tests, particularly at the unit level, can sometimes be about demonstrating and confirming that some things work rather than more aggressively trying to test it and check it and find issues with it. Some of these points here come from the workshop that we ran at EuroSTAR and the challenges and experiences. I mentioned already iterative development of variable scope in terms of the fact that you now need to you've got working code there the whole time, the system builds, and so testing happens continuously rather than a phase at the end of the project, so to speak. And similarly, when you start writing tests, you do that at the start of the iterations as early as possible as the scope is becoming clear. Sorry, Susan, I'm getting some background noise there. Full integration of testing, of testers into the development team. They are just another role in the team now. That role needs to be clarified. That was the point raised at the workshop, and testers need to be involved in that definition. It's a collaborative role. Obviously, co-location helps when you can do that. The role of the tester as well can be to consult on good testing, both at the acceptance level, supporting the business representatives, the customer, as well as the developers too. In terms of the reliance there is now on unit testing and automation of unit testing, what constitutes a good unit test? And the role that testers can play in supporting developers in that activity is very important. And as I mentioned, testers are now involved earlier, and often it's an integral part of Agile methods and test-driven development is to have that early involvement. And that's been a very positive experience for traditional independent testers. Similarly, working with those documentation means that the solution to that is to focus on communication. Co-location obviously helps to focus on the relationships with the business stakeholders and customers. Test-driven development and the specification role that the test cases play is obviously a key benefit here as well, or a key solution strategy to this particular challenge. Testers themselves are able to should be focusing on minimizing waste and so on. And with tight timescales and short iteration cycles, again, the test documentation needs to be revisited in terms of moving from, let's say, heavier test specifications and so on to more lightweight documentation where you're maybe minimizing unnecessary detail. An example of that would be, do you really need to be defining your procedural steps, or can you make assumptions that the people who are going to be doing testing on this project are familiar with the domain and the application and therefore will know how to run a test. You're defining more what to test rather than how to test. It's a call you need to make, but it's one strategy that we've seen adopted in Agile projects to help maybe reduce the level of detail of the documentation. Minimizing duplication, examples of that would be to refer to other documentation, if it exists, that has information rather than duplicating. Multi-purpose would be around maybe using the same template to record your actual results as well as your that type of thing. Checklists of common types of tests. So rather than duplicating these tests for input validation of a user interface, for example, we'll have a checklist that you use for every screen for common date formats and field entry into fields in terms of numbers and strings and so on, the kind of tests you might do for that. So again, the tester looks at the process they use, the deliverables they produce, and that requires some change in an Agile environment. The skill set, in certain cases, organizations talk about how their developers have to become programmers. They've got to develop programming skills. But many of the organizations at the workshop describe how, what they do is that the developers define the test, and the testers define the test, and the developers automate them on their behalf, and they have no problems with that type of strategy. So it isn't necessarily a requirement that happens, but it depends on the environment. In some cases, it's a significant benefit. And developers and testers need to potentially take on additional skills and develop additional skills. New opportunities, of course, are created for testers as well, in terms of analysis, programming, and so on. So the role of the tester is going to involve these types of activities and being involved continuously from the start. Better communication with the different stakeholders and facilitating that communication as a mediator as such between the two has often been a role testers have played, and it becomes increasingly important in these Agile environments without heavy documentation. Helping the customers define their acceptance criteria, maybe helping to create the automated tests or getting the developers to do it on their behalf. And expanding the scope of acceptance tests is a key point I want to make before I finish up here on the next couple of slides. Advising on risk and so on, providing that information during exploratory test. So test-driven development, very simply, is about writing your test first and then writing the code and then refactoring so that you don't changing code without changing the external behavior. So the fact that that test is failing first, it's an automated test failing first of all shows that it isn't always going to pass without having the code there. It takes on a specification role, as we're going to see. You can do this at the unit level and at the acceptance level. Unit level is driving design. These test cases are effectively executable design specifications. You're answering the question with these tests, does the code do what the developers intend? At the acceptance level, these tests are defining completion and therefore are effectively executable requirements. So does the system do what the customer requires? So again, it's a form of variety testing as well, but it does testing takes on a specification role and makes up, let's say, for the lack of detailed requirement specifications and design documentation. So the acceptance test feature isn't specified until the acceptance tests are written. It's not done until they pass. Both levels of tests become key requirements and design artifacts. At the unit level, obviously, it's more likely to be done because developers like coding, and therefore, if testing is coding, there's a psychological issue going on there as well. It's done as part of development. It's integrated. There's frameworks there to support you, your J unit, your N unit, and so on. Structural coverage measurement provides some degree of visibility on the amount of testing so that you get, say, 80% statement coverage or branch coverage, whatever your targets are. And the fact that you're able to do continuous build and integration and run these tests continuously ensures maximum regression and maintaining stable, robust systems with all this change going on. However, there is a need, obviously, to engineer that test code in the same way as you engineer your development code with the same level of rigor, otherwise it becomes unmaintainable. There are some issues we've seen are coverage complacency in terms of simply invoking units of code with actual no checking may give you some structural coverage, but you're not actually testing. You're not actually checking and doing any kind of verification. So although these approaches, test-driven development, behavior-driven development, are specification-based approaches in terms of they're design-based approaches, we also need to consider testing. Testing should not be forgotten about in terms of these approaches, and therefore the quality of those tests are very important. Similarly, the happy path testing, just running some tests just to show the basic functionality is met and doing a demo rather than trying to find faults. At the acceptance level, designing and coding with automation in mind, obviously, is an important factor to consider here, having clearly defined APIs and hooks in the code, for example, logging files to give traceability, having consistent standards for your user interface in terms of naming and so on. These are all ways to make this easier. There are frameworks there in place as well, like FIT, Framework for Integrated Test, FITNESS, Exactor, ACT, so on. Sometimes, again, the issue is the business focus of these tests. And also the fact that you can, some of the frameworks are driving the application directly through APIs rather than through the front end or user interface or browser. So again, if there's functionality, if there's business logic in that user interface, that isn't being tested, and that can be an issue. But maybe it's an area that gets covered in exploratory testing, for example. So is this acceptance testing sufficient? Unit level automation, acceptance level automation? It may not be, because it depends on the risk of a situation. We may need to expand these to include what we may have done traditionally at the system level, broader functional tests that are more focused on trying to break the system, the non-functional areas that I mentioned, more end-to-end business scenarios, system integration issues. A lot of these don't drive out directly from iteration-based development in terms of where you're focusing on a small feature set to deliver an iteration. You need to consider sometimes the bigger picture, particularly for later iterations, and your strategy needs to be adaptive and risk-driven. So, with each of the iterations you're going to be doing your development and your testing. Your testing is probably going to include automated acceptance testing, automated unit testing, and manual exploratory testing. But additionally, in parallel with the subsequent iterations, as part of your risk-based testing strategy, that's adaptive, you need to consider what additional exploratory testing could be performed, what non-functional areas could be covered, what about business cycle testing, end-to-end testing, and so on. So this is all about test strategy, and the point here is that simply, using something like XP that advocates two levels of testing may be insufficient in different situations, depending on the context and the level of risk that you're dealing with. We're nearly out of time. We started slightly late, but just a couple of quick points on exploratory testing. It's kind of concurrent test design, execution, and learning. You're getting constant feedback from the test you're running. You're coming up with new tests based on the result of the last test. It's an experience-based technique, and often it's mixed with the automated acceptance testing that we talked about. Or when you're doing manual testing, it's mixed with structured manual documented testing. It's a more creative process, and for examples would be you're looking at a particular area of functionality that may be high risk. To do more thorough testing of it, you're looking for bugs that you found earlier. You're looking for similar types of bugs in different parts of the system, missing features, opportunity for improvement, and so on. So it's a very powerful, productive form of testing that can be blended with the automated testing quite effectively in an agile environment. Again, a couple of quotes here in terms of why Agile lends itself to exploratory. Basically because the program always runs, it's ready to be explored. Potentially as well, two levels of testing that's automated may be insufficient from a strategy point of view. Similarly, because of the fact that you may have automation directly driving the applications through the APIs and so on, you can, without, let's say, having the GUI in place, you can still do exploratory testing. The test automation facilitates early exploratory testing, which is an important point to bear in mind. Okay, that was it. I think we're just about out of time. So let's look and see if we can identify any questions, or if anybody wants to add any more questions. Let me see. So regarding testers' skill set, can the testers automate the test themselves? If the testers can improve their programming skills, that can benefit them as well in the long term. I agree, absolutely. But it depends on the situation you're in, the type of testers you have. Some testers and their levels of experience, they'd have a tendency to learn very quickly how to program, how to perform this type of activities, whereas in other organizations, the type of profile of your testers may have difficulty in terms of making that change and taking on those additional roles. But if they can, I agree, it's a powerful addition to the team. The testers are just another member of the team. They're focusing on testing, but they're automating those tests as part of what they do, at the acceptance level in particular. Let's look at a couple of other questions here now. Just Susan, though, I think, did you want to make an announcement at this point before we finish off with the questions? Maybe not. Okay, she can come back and finish. I think she has announcement at the end about an Agile testing workshop in Stockholm later in the year. Okay, let me see. How many numbers of iterations is needed in Agile is another question here. Well, that's completely dependent on what the purpose of your iterations are, in terms of, are you delivering to your end client at the end of each of these iterations? Then it becomes a case of, let's say if you're using Scrum, the iterations are called sprints. Maybe they're 30-day cycles. Maybe it's just a way of working to deliver an overall system in a number of increments in 30-day cycles, focused on the most important functionality up front. So the number of iterations, you may have an overall idea in your mind of how many you need, but that may adapt. What you focus on in each iteration may change based on feedback from your client. Something that wasn't important to them before becomes very important next month. So the number of iterations is purely dependent on the overall scope that you want to deliver over a period of time. Other organizations, let's say, who are developing products, may just use iterations for internal development purposes, to use that approach for development, but yet they're still keeping their 6-monthly or whatever it is release cycles in place. So again, the number of iterations are just planned to deliver that overall functionality over that period of time. So the number of iterations, the size of the iterations are typically 2 to 4 weeks that we've seen. The number depends on the scope that you want to take on over a period of time in collaboration with your customer. Let me see. With testers working within development teams, how does a tester go about maintaining a degree of independence without being heavily influenced by developers? Well, it's a very fine line, I think, in Agile approaches. In a sense, the tester really is part of the team collaborating with developers and testers. So from that point of view, with the use of unit testing and so on, maybe the need for independence is maybe slightly reduced. Again, it depends on the situation you're in. But the key way I think it's achieved is through the use of defining tests up front. So acceptance tests, for example, the tester may collaborate with the user, customer representatives, business stakeholders to identify what it is that's required to come up with the acceptance test cases, which supplement and expand on the user stories, for example. So that's defined potentially in isolation from the actual, code and design and so on. It's independent from that perspective because you've done it up front. Similarly, the developers who are going to be designing test cases as part of their design process before they write their code, there's a level of independence being introduced there in terms of they're not being influenced by the code they've written. They're thinking about what their design is supposed to do and writing test cases that will define, in a sense, that design. So that upfront test design, I think, is the key way that's supported from that point of view. But very much it's a team ownership, a team collaboration, and therefore, the traditional roles of independent QA go away from that perspective. Let me see. What automation tool would you suggest for acceptance automation? Well, I'm not a tool expert. I have a colleague here, Ken Brenner, who's helping me select the questions here. If you're much better placed to answer that, I'll give you his email if you want. But I think it depends. There's a lot of these tools are available for the different languages and platforms, And I mentioned a couple in some of those slides, like FIS and Exactor. There's Spec as well that's come out more recently. So there's a number of open source tools that are available for the acceptance level in terms of those frameworks that are in place for acceptance level testing. So let me see any more. Two integration questions there. Let me see. How do you see integration end-to-end type testing roles in an Agile community? And is Agile suitable for integration in the large testing? Well, I think that if you look at some simplistic definition of testing with XP type of approaches, for example, where you've simply got a unit level and acceptance level, it appears that there isn't a focus on those type of system integration type issues, which is why you need to supplement them, I believe, with a more broader and adaptive testing strategy that would focus as appropriate in terms of maybe not the first iteration, maybe on the third iteration, you start to focus on system integration type issues. So I think that's an important area to supplement the simplistic view of testing. And to add to it, because if system integration is at risk, it needs to be tested, and therefore it needs to be done potentially. That slide I showed, which showed this additional testing you may do in parallel with your kind of user story focused tests, needs to be considered, and you need to have an adaptive strategy that deals with that. So from that point of view, I believe it can be used with Agile, but you've got to modify some of the standard Agile approaches and definitions to include them.
Distributed teams and things like that, offshore teams, distributed teams.
Let me see. It's very popular with offshoring nowadays. It seems like it shouldn't work so good with separate teams, with separate test teams offshore, offsite from the developers. I agree, it creates a lot of challenges because the whole concept here is to have a closely knit, collaborating, highly communicative team that have this kind of shared responsibility to develop the system. So once you get away from co-location, you get into offshoring, you get into different time domains, it puts a lot of pressure on that communication, which is where documentation, in the sense of, and kind of one of the objectives of documentation is to help with that communication. So, the issue there is can you, first of all, create that kind of collaborative working culture? And to do that, as was mentioned in terms of the experiences of some of the people at the Agile workshop at EuroSTAR, you need to develop that rapport. So having face-to-face interactions and meetings and so on to get a team to get to know each other, having cultural days, that type of thing, then followed by periodic get-togethers where people meet up face-to-face and have to travel to other locations is one way to get that kind of rapport going. And the other issue then is the collaborative tools, that you can use to enhance communication. Whether that's through kind of high-quality video conferencing and other collaborative tools, then that alleviates the problem. But it does create more challenge and strain, and not all organizations have been successful when they've tried to do Agile with multi-site. Let me see. Where do you put the responsibility for writing system tests and integration tests? Do you automate them? Well, I think that depends on the organization. If you've got a highly, if you've got a customer and end user representatives who do get highly engaged and that improve their or have the testing skills, they obviously can get quite heavily involved in kind of end-to-end type testing and so on, acceptance type testing. At the system level, and in terms of the system type tests and so on, some of the tests that could be done at that acceptance level includes them, but I think that is a key role that, let's say, testers play within Agile teams, is to consider those areas of system tests that maybe aren't going to be covered by the automated acceptance tests, because there are different situations where the acceptance tests suffer from a lack of customer involvement. So you don't always have a highly motivated customer there working with you and a very continuous basis as part of the team, which puts more pressure, for example, on the system to what would have been traditionally system tests, and therefore more of that needs to be done in those situations. But again, it's about context, it's about risk, and the issue is it's test strategy. So the test strategy needs to be defined in the context of a different each situation and based on risk. Let me see. I'm not sure how we can keep going. We'll just answer one or two more, and then I think we may need to stop. Let me see. I haven't read this. It's just not. Sorry. Is this not just a different term for the good practices that we have been using for the last 20 years? That is, customer first, adapt to change as it is inevitable. We have always adapted to context. The V model and other early life cycle models have always focused on analyzing the requirements at each stage at the point that they are written to prevent defects and influence the design from a completeness perspective. I agree. Like, certain people take on the view that traditional development is ineffective because of the problems that you see with pressure on testing at the end, the lack of early testing and so on, heavy documentation that isn't really serving much value, and there's a lot of waste. So, but there are many good implementations of more sequential life cycles, which have the kind of things you just mentioned there in your question. So I totally agree with you. A lot of these practices and some of the concepts within test-driven development have been around for a long time. But Agile does take it further, I think, in terms, for example, of the way in which the team works, the way in which you don't have this independent kind of quality gate at the end and this separation of roles. And as well as some of the practices in terms of continuous build and integration and automation of the test at the unit level, they're not very common, I think, in traditional practices. Getting developers to do good unit level testing has always been a challenge with the traditional approaches. And I think one of the benefits of Agile is that by implementing a test-driven approach and having automation at the unit level, you're much more likely to get developers doing effective unit testing, which I think is a change as well. So there are a number of changes and highly iterative approaches and so on that I think are bringing more and different good practices to the situation, to the organization.
Okay, Fran, will we just leave it there?
Okay, yeah, there are a couple more questions there.
Okay, yeah. I just wanted to announce that if you enjoyed today's webinar, please note that this is available as a one-day tutorial taking place on May 20th in Stockholm, Sweden. The timetable is up in front of you on the screen, and if you'd like any further information, please call the number or you can email us at info@qualityconferences.com. Fran and Ken, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to be here today. I'm sorry about the audio problem. This webinar will be recorded and available on our website. So for anyone that didn't get to see it in full or missed some of the audio, it'll be available.
Okay, great, and thanks very much to those who participated. And I think that the file has been uploaded as well, so people can download that PDF. And email is on it.
Give them instructions. There's a handouts bar. Did you tell them about that?
No.
There's a handout, it looks like three little A4 pages. If you select that, you can download a PDF version of Fran's presentation today.